The sun over St. Petersburg, Florida, on that Saturday in June 2012, was the kind that baked the tar in the seams of the roads and made the air over the parking lots shimmer. It was a heat that felt heavy, biblical, a blanket of humid warmth that promised no relief, only the slow, simmering descent into a balmy evening. Danielle Harkins, a 35-year-old woman known to her students and colleagues as a dedicated, if somewhat intense, middle school teacher, felt a different kind of heat. It was an internal fire, a conviction that had been building for months, a certainty that the world was not as it seemed. She saw shadows where others saw only shade. She heard whispers in the rustle of the palm fronds that lined the streets of her neat suburban neighborhood. The ordinary had begun to peel back at the edges, revealing something darker, something truer, lurking beneath the placid surface of everyday life. She had always been a seeker. Friends from her college years at the University of South Florida would have described her as spiritually curious, drawn to the metaphysical and the unexplained. But where that curiosity had once been a gentle exploration of yoga and meditation, it had recently taken a sharp, dark turn. It began with books ordered online and delivered in plain brown packaging. Tomes on medieval demonology, grimoires claiming to hold ancient secrets, academic texts on the history of Satanism. She spent her evenings not grading papers, but hunched over these volumes, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her highlighter tracing passages about possession and exorcism. The clean, modern lines of her apartment seemed to mock the ancient, fearful knowledge she was consuming. She started watching videos late into the night, grainy footage from obscure sources, lectures by self-proclaimed experts on the infernal. The blue light of the screen washed over her face, her expression a mixture of fascination and dread. The digital age had democratized damnation, and Danielle was an eager student. Her friends noticed the shift. The vibrant, engaged woman they knew began to withdraw. Invitations to book club were declined. Friday night drinks were met with vague excuses. When they did see her, there was a new distance in her eyes, a preoccupation that made conversation difficult. She spoke in abstractions, about purity and corruption, about light and a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but a tangible, sentient force. "You just don't see it," she'd say to her friend Sarah over a coffee that went largely untouched. "It's all around us. It's in the advertisements, the music, the way people talk. It's a spiritual pollution. It gets inside you." Sarah had laughed it off, attributing it to stress, to burnout from a difficult school year. "Danny, you need a vacation. Go to Siesta Key for a weekend. Get some sun. Read a trashy novel." But Danielle had just shaken her head, a sad, knowing smile on her lips. "The sun doesn't burn it away, Sarah. It's deeper than that." The change was most apparent in her classroom. Her lessons, once creative and engaging, began to take on a morbid, moralistic tone. A unit on Gothic literature became a springboard for discussions about real-life evil. A science lesson on microbiology twisted into a metaphor for how unseen demons could infect a soul. She started singling out students, not for misbehavior, but for what she perceived as a spiritual listlessness, a darkness clinging to them. She would pull them aside after class, her voice low and earnest. "Are you okay?" she'd ask. "You seem heavy lately." The students, 12 and 13 years old, navigating the treacherous waters of adolescence, were flattered and unnerved by the attention. They were at an age where they felt invisible to the adult world, yet here was a teacher, an authority figure, seeing something in them, something profound and secret. She cultivated a small group of them, the sensitive ones, the outsiders, the kids who wore black band t-shirts and wrote poetry in their notebooks. She made them feel special, chosen. She spoke to them not as children, but as initiates, as fellow seekers who could perceive the rot that others ignored. She began to call them her circle, her true students. She started a club, an unofficial gathering that met sometimes after school, sometimes on weekends. It was presented as a philosophy group, a place to discuss big ideas, but the ideas were always dark. She spoke of cleansing, of purging, of the need to be strong enough to confront the evil that permeated the world. She spoke of demons not as mythological constructs, but as real parasitic entities that fed on human weakness. They attached themselves to the soul, she told them, and festered there, causing depression, anger, confusion, and pain. The only way to be free was to force them out. The only way to be clean was to burn the infection away. The children listened, their eyes wide. They were captivated. This was real. This was important. This explained the aching loneliness they felt, the inexplicable anger, the deep sadness that sometimes washed over them for no reason. It wasn't their fault. It wasn't hormones or brain chemistry. It was an infestation. And Ms. Harkins had the cure. The plan for the ritual at the pier was not spontaneous. It had been building in Danielle's mind for weeks, the details clarified by her research. The location was chosen with purpose. The St. Petersburg Pier jutted out into Tampa Bay, a place between worlds, not quite land, not quite sea. It was a public place, but the approach, a grassy area dotted with palms and sea grapes, offered pockets of privacy, especially as dusk gathered. The time was chosen, crepuscular, the hour of the in-between, when the veil between worlds was said to be at its thinnest. Fire was the central element. It was the ultimate purifier, the sacred destroyer. It was the only element that could truly annihilate, leaving only ash in its wake. Danielle gathered the supplies. A bottle of cheap perfume, its alcohol content high, a small, sharp knife, a lighter. She felt a profound sense of purpose, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She was not a monster. She was a healer, a liberator. She was going to save these children. She contacted 7 members of her circle, the chosen ones. She told them it was time. Time to be free. Time to be brave. Time to become pure. The parents of these children noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Their sons and daughters said they were going to meet friends at the pier, a common weekend hangout. It was a Saturday. The sky was beginning to soften from a hard blue to a muted gold when the group gathered. The 7 teenagers, ranging in age from 13 to 15, stood in a loose circle around Danielle. She looked different outside of the classroom. She wore a long dark skirt and a plain black t-shirt. Her hair, usually neatly styled, was pulled back in a severe ponytail. Her eyes held a fervent, glinting light. The air was still warm, but a breeze was picking up off the bay, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. Danielle built a small fire in a cleared patch of sand, using twigs and dried grass. The flames were small, hesitant at first, then caught hold, snapping and crackling. The circle tightened around it. The normal sounds of the pier, the distant laughter of tourists, the cry of gulls, the hum of traffic, seemed to fade away, replaced by the sound of the fire and the sound of Danielle's voice. She began to speak, her tone low and hypnotic. She talked about the world they lived in, a world asleep, a world drowning in spiritual filth. She spoke of the courage it took to truly see. She told them they were the ones who could see. And because they could see, they had been targeted. The darkness had latched onto them. "It's inside you," she said, her gaze moving from one young, anxious face to another. "It's a weight you carry. It's the source of your pain, your fear, your sadness. You've carried it for too long." She held up the knife. The setting sun glinted off the blade. "The body is just a vessel," she intoned. "To let the spirit out, you must first open the vessel. The pain is a doorway. The pain is a release. Who will be first? Who is brave enough to be free?" There was a long, terrified silence. The children looked at each other, then back at their teacher. This was real. The theory was becoming practice. The idea was becoming action. A boy 14 with shaggy brown hair and a nervous disposition stepped forward. He was the one who struggled the most, the one Danielle had focused on the most. He was often absent, His grades were poor, his parents were going through a divorce. He was ripe for infestation. He was the most in need of cleansing. "I'll go first," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Danielle smiled, a beatific, terrifying smile. "You are so brave," she said. She instructed him to hold out his arm. His hand was trembling. "The demon inside you is causing this fear," she said softly. "This weakness. We will drive it out." With a quick, sure motion, she drew the tip of the knife across the palm of his hand. He gasped, a sharp intake of breath. A thin line of blood welled up from the cut. "See?" Danielle said, her voice rising with excitement. "See the corruption? The impurity? It must be sealed. It must be purified." She flicked the lighter. The flame sprang to life. She held it to the cut. But the breeze, the constant, gentle breeze from the bay, blew it out. She tried again. Again, the flame died. A frown creased her brow. This was a test, a sign of resistance from the entity within. It was fighting back. It was stronger than she thought. She would have to be stronger. She picked up the bottle of perfume. "This will help," she murmured, more to herself than to the boy. "The alcohol, it will feed the sacred fire." Before he could react, before anyone could process what was happening, she upended the bottle over his bleeding palm. The liquid splashed over the wound, the sharp, cloying scent of artificial flowers filling the air. The boy winced as the alcohol stung the open cut. Then Danielle sparked the lighter again and touched it to his wet skin. The perfume ignited with a soft whump. Blue and orange flames engulfed the boy's hand. For a split second, there was no sound but the fire. Then the boy screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of absolute agony. He tried to pull his hand back, but Danielle held his wrist firmly, her face a mask of intense concentration. "Almost done," she said through gritted teeth. "It's almost gone. Be strong." The flames burned for only a few seconds before she finally released him, and he fell to his knees, clutching his blackened, blistering hand to his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. The other children stared, frozen in horror. The reality of the pain, the smell of burnt flesh and hair cutting through the perfume and the sea air, shattered the mystical trance. This was not a game. This was not a theory. But Danielle was undeterred. The ritual had to continue. The demon had been expelled from the boy, but it could try to jump to another host. They all had to be cleansed. She turned to a girl, 15, who had always been quiet and artistic. She had confided in Danielle about her struggles with anxiety, about the dark thoughts that sometimes filled her head. Danielle saw her as a prime vessel. "Your turn," Danielle said, her voice still calm, still infused with that terrifying certainty. The girl shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No. Please, Miss Harkins. No." "The anxiety is the demon speaking," Danielle insisted, stepping closer. "It's lying to you. It's telling you to be afraid of freedom. Don't listen." The girl tried to back away, but she stumbled. A shard of a broken beer bottle lay in the sand nearby. In a movement swift and brutal, Danielle snatched it up. She saw the demon's fear in the girl's resistance. It was cornered. It had to be driven out. She lunged, not at the girl's arm, but at her neck. The jagged glass bit into the soft skin below the girl's ear. She cried out, more in shock than pain at first, as a trickle of blood ran down her neck. Danielle dropped the glass. She pulled the small key from her pocket, a simple house key. She held it in the flames of the small fire until the metal glowed a dull orange. "This will seal it," she whispered. "This will make sure it never returns." She pressed the white-hot metal against the bleeding cut on the girl's neck. There was a sizzling sound, like meat hitting a hot grill. The girl's scream was cut short as she fainted, collapsing into the sand. The spell was broken. The remaining 5 children stumbled backward, their faces masks of terror. The boy was cradling his brutally burned hand. The girl was unconscious on the ground, an angry red burn blistering on her neck. Their teacher stood between them and the dying fire, her eyes wild, her hands stained with blood and ash. She was still murmuring about purification, about victory, but the words were lost on them now. All they heard was the madness. One of the boys, his survival instinct kicking in, turned and ran. He didn't look back. He just ran, across the grass, towards the lights of the parking lot, towards the normality of the city. The others, after a moment of paralyzed fear, followed. They scattered like leaves in the wind, leaving their teacher and their 2 injured friends behind. Danielle Harkins did not chase them. She stood watching them go, a look of profound disappointment on her face. They had failed the test. They had chosen fear over freedom. She turned her attention to the 2 who had been cleansed. She had to get them home. They would understand. In time, they would thank her. The boy who ran did not stop until he reached the house of his best friend, a boy who was not part of the circle. He was gasping for air, tears and streams mingling on his face. He held out his burned hand. The story tumbled out of him in ragged, hysterical fragments. The fire, the perfume, the knife. Miss Harkins. His friend's parents listened, their disbelief quickly turning to horror. They called the police. The St. Petersburg Police Department responded quickly. Officers found Danielle Harkins at her apartment. She was calm. She was composed. She seemed surprised by their presence. The 2 injured teenagers were found at their homes. Their parents were initially confused. The boy claimed he had burned his hand on a motorcycle exhaust. The girl said she had cut her neck on a branch and tried to cauterize it herself with a heated knife. They were terrified. They were ashamed. They had been part of something they didn't understand, and their teacher's influence, even in her absence, was powerful enough to make them lie. But the physical evidence was undeniable, and the story from the friend was too specific, too bizarre to be fabricated. Detectives pressed them. Slowly, reluctantly, the truth emerged. Danielle Harkins was arrested and charged with multiple counts of aggravated battery and child abuse. The news broke like a thunderclap over the quiet community. The Tampa Bay Times ran the story. NBC picked it up. The narrative was irresistible and horrifying. Florida devil-worshipping teacher burns student. The word satanic was never officially used, but it hung in the air, unspoken, fueling a special kind of panic. Neighbors who had lived next to Danielle for years were interviewed on camera, expressing shock and disbelief. She seemed so normal, they said over and over again, the refrain of every tragedy that reveals the monster next door. She was a teacher. She loved children. The school district went into immediate lockdown mode. She was fired. Counselors were brought in for students. Parents held their children a little tighter, looking with newfound suspicion at the educators they entrusted them to every day. The 7 children, the victims, became ghosts in their own town. They did not speak to the media. They retreated into themselves and their families, burdened by a trauma that was both physical and profoundly psychological. They had been betrayed by an authority figure they trusted. They had been convinced that evil was inside them, and the method of its expulsion had been torture. That belief, that internalized corruption, is a poison that is not easily antidoted. In the sterile light of the interrogation room, Detective Puetz of the St. Petersburg Police Department tried to understand. He sat across from Danielle Harkins, who even in handcuffs maintained an aura of serene conviction. "Why, Danielle?" he asked, his voice calm, neutral. "What were you trying to accomplish?" She looked at him with pity, as if he were the one who was blind, who was lost. "You wouldn't understand," she said softly. "It's not about understanding. Help me understand. What religion was this? What were you trying to do to those children?" She shook her head. It wasn't about religion. It was about truth. It was about cleansing. They were infected. I was healing them. By setting a boy on fire? By cutting a girl's neck with a broken bottle? "The body is a shell," she explained, as if to a slow child. "Pain is temporary. The spirit is eternal. The fire purifies. It burns away the corruption. They are clean now. They are free." She offered no name for her belief system, no organized doctrine, no master or demon she was serving. There was only her books, her videos, and the absolute unshakable certainty that had grown like a tumor in her mind, fed by isolation and spiritual yearning twisted into something monstrous. She was not a devil worshipper in any traditional sense. She was something perhaps more common, and in some ways more terrifying. She was a true believer in her own delusion. She had constructed a personal apocalypse and appointed herself its sole savior. The children were not participants in a ritual. They were patients in a surgery she was performing without anesthetic, without consent, without a license. The case never went to a full trial. Danielle Harkins was evaluated and found to be not competent to stand trial. The line between criminality and insanity, between evil and psychosis, was deemed too blurred. She was committed to a state psychiatric facility, a place where the demons she saw everywhere could, perhaps, be medicated into submission. But the question remains, lingering like a bad smell. What happened to Danielle Harkins? Was it a sudden break? Or was it a slow, steady seduction by an idea? A descent into a world where symbolism becomes reality, where metaphor becomes mandate. She started by looking for meaning in the darkness, and eventually the darkness was all she could see. She became a prisoner of her own revelation, and in the end, she imprisoned children in it with her. The pier remains. Tourists still walk its length, fishing, taking pictures, enjoying the sunset. There is no plaque, no marker to indicate what happened in the sand below on a June evening. The city wanted to forget. The families wanted to forget. But the two scars remain, one on a hand, one on a neck, permanent, physical testaments to a moment when a teacher's lesson was literally seared into the flesh of her students. They are adults now. The memory of that day is a ghost that likely still whispers to them, a phantom pain that echoes the real one. They were told they were infected, and then they were brutally cleansed. The psychological wound is the deeper one.
The story of Danielle Harkins is not a simple tale of satanic panic.
It is a more complex and unsettling story about the human need for meaning, the vulnerability of the seeking mind, and the terrifying power of belief when it becomes divorced from reality. It is a story about how a person can become so convinced of the existence of monsters that they become one themselves, all the while believing, with every fiber of their being, that they are a hero. It is a story that happened not in a shadowy graveyard or a Gothic castle, but under the bright Florida sun, in a city known for its retirement communities and its beaches. A reminder that the darkness does not need a pentagram to manifest. Sometimes it only needs a lonely heart, a curious mind, and a single terrible idea, allowed to grow until it consumes everything it touches.